Hamas has been very consistent in their demands in a peace proposal. I blame the Democrats and the professional managerial classes for being just so relentlessly elitist and uncaring about the majority of people in the country for so many decades. So one reason for optimism in the election of Trump was, I also feel like the Democrats have progressively gotten more and more evil over the past several decades. So if you look at statistics, immigrants have lower crime rates than citizens. So the overblown statements about how we're going to deport 11 million people would completely crush the US economy. Now, maybe Trump is willing to completely crush the US economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider being a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts to the link given in the description box. But the least you can do is to watch, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest, Professor Aviva Chomsky. Professor Chomsky is a historian, and she writes extensively on immigration, climate change, and Palestine. Professor Chomsky, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
I want to kickstart with the new so-called Gaza plan. Some people say it's just a pronouncement. Given we hosted you earlier to discuss Palestine, Gaza, and place it in the larger context of Global South, and that was a good conversation. I wonder what your thoughts are on Trump's Gaza pronouncement, since he said that the U.S. would own Gaza without using military and without paying for it. And a lot of people are confused given it came right after the ceasefire plan. Some people don't agree it's a ceasefire plan, but whatever it is, about which the administration took a lot of credit. So I wonder how you are seeing these developments.
So let me start by saying that we're only a few weeks into this new Trump administration, and it's always difficult to see into people's minds and hearts about what may be motivating them. But it seems to me that there are three things going on with Donald Trump in all of what we've seen of him over the past decade and in the last month that he's been in office. One is his personality, which is perhaps rude and unpredictable and arrogant and narcissistic and all kinds of terrible things you can say about his personality. And even many Trump voters said, I don't really like the way he talks, but we want something from him. And I think there's certainly a level of unpredictability and even perhaps childishness in his personality where, he sees a tweet about something and then suddenly it turns into policy. And then a few days later, he forgets it. And, you distract him with a glass of apple juice and then he's on to something else. But that's just one piece of it. The second is his coterie, like who is he actually representing? And, it seems by the people he has surrounded himself with and who his strongest supporters are, is that it's sort of a coalition between the tech industry, the financial industry, and the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry, obviously, really closely tied in with the defense industry. They're almost one and the same. So that group of people has a very clear set of economic interests. And in some ways, I feel like they put up with Trump because they need someone in government with popular support that's going to be able to allow them to implement the economic policies and foreign policies that are truly in their interest. And they have a much more easily identifiable, clear-cut set of interests than Trump, the unpredictable individual, perhaps does. Um, so that's part two. And then part three is Trump's base. And obviously that intersects with the first two. Like he appeals to his base for purely personal and narcissistic reasons, but also for reasons of power. Um, and, many of his corporate backers, um, they'll switch on a dime. Today we're for DEI. Tomorrow we're against DEI. They don't care about DEI. They care about what some corporations call their social license to operate. So when they need to do DEI for their social license to operate, that doesn't cost them anything. When they need to denounce DEI for their social license to operate, they'll denounce it. That doesn't cost them anything either. Those are issues that both Trump and his financial sector backers are using to maintain the degree of popular legitimacy that they need to be able to implement policies which are really not in the popular interest, but they're like the red meat that they use to distract people. So I think all three of those are at work in what we've seen Trump doing in these first weeks. So if you want to, we could start with Palestine and Gaza. During the ever since October 8th, or let's say ever since December of 2024, there has been a really clear peace proposal on the table. And it's been proposed again and again. Biden initially was against it, but then claimed to be for it. Hamas has been very consistent in their demands in a peace proposal. And the Israeli government supposedly agreed to it. And then, the Israeli government is as unpredictable as Donald Trump. Unpredictable within the fact that there are a clear set of interests that are being pursued, but the day-to-day, today we're for it, today we're against it. Yes, we agreed. No, we didn't really agree. Well, I'll say one thing in English and one thing in Hebrew. I'm appealing to all these different sectors and trying to keep, Netanyahu also has his personal set of interests at stake here, as well as his right-wing Zionist set of interests. So yeah, there's a lot of factors going on there too. But that it was clear that the only thing that was going to actually force Israel to fully accept this peace proposal over and over and over again would be pressure from the United States, and that Joe Biden was just not willing to exert that pressure. He and Kamala Harris, and so, the Democratic Party, even though there's a lot of opposition in the Democratic Party as well, they talked about how heartbroken they were at seeing so many Palestinian deaths and how tragic it was, but they were not willing to exert the slightest amount of pressure on the Israeli government to actually live up to what they so many times said they would live up to in terms of that agreement. Trump lays down the law, and Biden caves Netanyahu caves instantly. So, during the early days after the election, I think there was a lot of optimism, like finally, like we hate Trump, but he's willing to stand up to Netanyahu. And if Biden had only done that a year ago, we'd be in a much better place right now, obviously. But there was kind of a sigh of relief. Like, we're so sick of this kowtowing to Netanyahu. But and Trump wanted to take credit for the agreement. Well, he didn't negotiate the agreement, but he wanted to take credit legitimately for finally pushing Netanyahu over the edge. It's my Freudian slip. I keep calling Netanyahu Biden. Into forcing him to agree. Like, the United States wasn't going to stand for it anymore. And then a couple weeks later, Trump turns around and says, just kidding. I didn't support the agreement after all. I want something totally different. I want all the hostages released on Saturday. I want Israel to go back to war. I want the United States to, he says all these contradictory things. And so saying that he wants the United States to take Gaza was just one of really three things. One, um, ditch even phase one of the agreement. I don't care about either side living up to it. Now I'm proposing something new. All the hostages released for nothing right now. Um, Ditch the whole idea of an agreement, and we support Israel going back to war. Whatever Israel wants, we're going to support it. And three, ditch the whole idea of the agreement, and the United States is going to take Gaza. So, the one that got the most international attention was the United States is going to take Gaza. And this also comes in the context of he already said the United States is going to take Panama, the United States is going to take Greenland, the United States is going to take Canada. And, it has us all scratching our heads. Is he appealing to some kind of a base here? Is he just talking off the top of his head? Like, is this the 3-year-old in Trump that's saying that? Or is this his backers, him as a mouthpiece for his backers? Or or is he appealing to his base? Which Trump is saying this? And in some ways, I feel like we don't really know. Um, but and then a lot of his backers tried to sort of cover for him and say, well, he didn't really mean it. He's just trying to stir things up. And, I do think that the mood of the American public is so disenchanted with the political elites and the professional managerial classes of our country that simply the idea of shaking things up and saying things that have been forbidden to say is a really popular move now. And, I don't blame the the bases for that. For a lot of that, I blame the Democrats and the professional managerial classes for being just so relentlessly elitist and uncaring about the majority of people in the country for so many decades. So yeah, the institutions don't work. We need to shake it up. I mean, I sympathize with that feeling, although you know, I it 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 doesn't turn me into a Trump supporter, but a lot of the things that Trump supporters say about the Democrats and the establishment and the institutions, I do agree with.
I'm very curious listening to you, given you must be aware, Professor Noam Chomsky famously debated in many places, including Jacobian and others, about the idea of lesser of two evils, for the lack of a better word. And at that time, I'm not saying what it is now, but at that time in 2020 and even in 2016, Professor Chomsky used to argue that the Trump is by far the most dangerous person. Um, I'm very curious listening to what you just said. How would you respond to that?
This was a matter of great debate among some of my closest friends and political allies leading up to the election. And in a way, I felt in a very privileged position living in Massachusetts, which is a blue state. So it was really easy for me to say I'm going to vote my conscience, um, which was, well, in the primary, I voted uncommitted, and then I voted for Claudia de la Cruz in the final election. I think it's a different calculus when you're living in a swing state. Not all of my friends agree with me, and I know many people in swing states who were just so utterly um, disgusted with Biden and Harris and like everything the Democrats did in the lead up to the election. Like if they had just done one thing to show that they cared about anything besides their own elitism, maybe, but no, it was nothing. Um, who just said they could not bring themselves to vote for him or for her. It was Harris in the end. But, as we were having these discussions over the months, first it was Biden and then it was Harris. Um, so, uh, and one of the things I thought about a lot in in the lead up to the election. And as it became increasingly clear that it was likely that Trump was going to win, so, we have to make lemonade out of our lemons. One of the optimistic things I saw in a Trump victory was the fact that there's a big kind of liberal-ish center in the United States that was really was so relieved when Biden won the election that so during the first Trump administration was able to mobilize, and we saw some of the largest mobilizations for things like racial justice in recent U.S. history under the first Trump administration, and for immigrant rights. When Biden was elected, of course there's some longstanding strong organizations that didn't disappear when Biden won the election, but there was a large liberal center, and especially of funders, who just breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Oh, now we're okay because Biden's president. We don't have to do anything anymore." And I mean, I think there was a serious weakening of those kinds of movements, not because the committed activists gave up, but because this I don't know if the liberal center is the right word for it. I just made that up right now. But I'm a sector of the population that was mobilizable under Trump that was not mobilizable under the Biden administration. So one reason for optimism in the election of Trump was that um, you know, mouthpieces like the mainstream press, which are pretty anti-Trump, much of it, wavering maybe, uh, universities, this liberal center, if we can call it that, is all of a sudden now they care about things like immigration again, when they didn't care when it was Biden doing the deporting. So I can't remember what your question was now, but did I answer it? I just went
Yeah,
off
I
on a
mean,
tangent.
yeah, I
Oh,
just,
so the lesser of two evils.
right.
Um, I also feel like the Democrats have progressively gotten more and more evil over the past several decades. So this idea of the lesser of two evils, um, when it I don't know. They've always been evil. I was going to go back to, I don't know if I have to go back to Roosevelt or, even in domestic terms, someone like Lyndon Johnson, obviously not in foreign policy terms, but that there used to be a sense that at least and this is something my dad always said also, that in foreign policy, there's no difference. The
Right.
difference is in domestic policy. Um, but that idea that there's a difference in domestic policy, I think, has really kind of evaporated over the years among
Yeah,
the
what
Democrats, certainly since the
Clinton,
90s,
yeah,
the
since
new
Clinton,
Democrats. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think that was the distinction of Roosevelt through Kennedy, Johnson. Those were
Yeah.
over by the
The sort of
Republican.
social welfare Democrats.
Yeah, so the whole 80s through Republicans, but then Clinton came in 90s and then solidified that with a lot of deregulations of the banking sector, the financial sector, repeal of the
Financial sector.
Glass-Steagall, and it was all over. Um,
And in terms of climate, which
right,
it's interesting that when you mentioned that you wanted us to talk about climate issues, the extent to which, since the election, nobody is talking about climate issues. Like that liberal center that's willing to get mobilized over immigrant rights, it seems like everyone's forgotten about climate issues. And I wonder to what extent that is. I was highly critical of Biden's so-called climate policies, as I was highly critical of his immigration policies. But it's so clear that the United States just keeps consuming, emitting, and producing more and more fossil fuels, even under a Biden administration that says, "Oh yeah, we want to do something about it. We're going to give lots more money to the fossil fuel companies to help them develop technologies that will never work, that will let us use more fossil fuels." I don't know. Whereas Trump just says we don't care. But so I don't know if people have given up on climate or if they just like throw up their hands in despair or what it is. But I don't feel like it's getting people out in the streets or people are even writing about it very much.
Talking about people out in the streets, and we were discussing Palestine. So, to ask a last question on that is the implication on the United States itself. We are heading towards an American spring. We don't know if it would be socially and economically, politically spring or winter, but nevertheless, spring is coming. And last spring, we saw massive student, what was called as the student encampments. These were sit-in demonstrations all over universities, and it was like one of the massive deepening of the Palestinian solidarity movement in terms of spreading education among the American people, which
Hmm.
is kind of deepening of democracy. I mean, it was almost like if American democracy deepens through these progressive spells like civil rights, anti-Vietnam demonstrations, this was one of those moments where a lot of people were aware of the crimes committed by Israel. And that was very, very ruthlessly crushed under the Biden administration itself, including top universities like Harvard. And I was just curious, given you work in university space, what's your sense of where the situation is heading in terms of any possibility of domestic mobilization, given Norman Finkelstein recently said that the issue of Gaza has become an issue of academic freedom and free speech in the United States. So he proposed the slogan, and I'm disclosing it without his permission. He said, "Free Gaza, free speech" can be one of a mobilizing speech for in the university campuses. Given Trump administration has sent clear signals, even though we haven't seen any actual working, as clear signal that they're going to be extremely intolerant, particularly with foreign students, but also domestic students, in terms of any solidarity with the Palestinian cause. What's your sense of where the university spaces are now on this issue?
So I was listening to one analysis in the last couple of weeks, and I can't remember who it was, um, saying maybe it was Abdul Jawad Omar. Anyway, saying that the caving that that when U.S. universities caved on free speech regarding Palestine, allowed themselves to be steamrolled, um, and did not protect their students, did not protect their faculty, simply said, we're going to go along with whatever the far right tells us to. That set a precedent which is now coming back to bite them because the Trump administration is actually pushing them on many more issues. So, like, they dug their own grave when they decided to cave on Palestine. I think it was Abdul Jawad Omar. Uh, and I also should just point out that higher education in the United States is not only Harvard and Columbia and Princeton, but that's what we hear about. So I always get a little uneasy when I hear people talking about higher education in the United States, because the majority of higher education in the United States is actually institutions more like where I teach, which is a regional public university that never gets in the national news. Um, but I think we've seen a variety of reactions on the part of university administrations. Many of them have immediately uh, scrambled to abide in the most draconian ways by what they think these new executive orders are telling and memos are telling them to do. Okay, we're going to get rid of DEI. We're going to get rid of all our diversity requirements. We're going to abolish all these classes. We're not going to let anybody talk about this. We're not going to let anybody talk about that. Um, but I was reading the most recent memo, I think it was Friday's memo yesterday with a colleague here, and kind of trying to parse it and saying, is Salem State going to feel like they have to change anything upon reading this in order to comply? And universities are scared of losing federal funding. And, Trump, with this slew of executive orders and actions, is certainly putting those kinds of fears into everybody, of losing jobs, losing funding, saying I say it so I can do it if I say it. Um, so, but what the Friday's memo actually prohibited was really some kinds of marginal things that don't go anywhere near as far as what the universities are overdoing their reactions. So we were looking at it saying, I think the only thing that Salem State might have to change to fully comply with this memo is that in our human resources department has some rules about hiring, like diversity rules about hiring, like the hiring committees. We haven't been able to hire anyone in my department for so many years. I can't remember what the exact rules are, but there was something like we had to make an effort to consider candidates of color and underrepresented groups when we were going through our hiring. It was very mild. It didn't actually force us to do anything, but we had to sign something saying we considered marginalized candidates when we. So maybe we'll have to get rid of that. But we couldn't see anything else that we do that actually would have to change to comply with the order. And looking at what other universities are doing, they're just bending over backwards and going way beyond anything that they're actually being required to do. Because, the basic piece of that memo was you can't treat students of different races differently. And like, do I ever do that in my classroom? Do I ever say, okay, you students are white, so you have to do this assignment, and you students are black, so you have to, it's just absurd. Like, of course we treat all our students equally. Um, anyway, so again, things are very much in flux. And you know, in what ways is there going to be some coalescing of standing up to this? And in what ways are universities um, feeling like it's more in their interest to completely cave, like way beyond what's even being demanded of them? It's hard to tell right now. But certainly, um, what happened last spring, I think truly weakened the ability of elite universities, because almost all of those cases happened at elite universities, uh, to stand up for the basic rights of faculty and students, rights to freedom of speech, freedom of expression.
Yeah, there's also seems to be a two levels of relationship. One is how university is responding to some of the administrative changes, including federal fundings and so on and so forth. And then there is a layer of students' relationship and students and sometimes even faculty's relationship with the administration itself. Even there is a clamp down there as well. So there are these two layers when it comes to these issues. I want to come to immigration
Mhm.
and just correct me if it's wrong. It's my reading as a layman reader of news. I'm not a scholar on this issue. What I've seen recently is that immigration has been made very centrally a security issue within the administration. Earlier, like within the legal administrative apparatus, it would be like crimes. It would be legality and illegality. Sometimes it's IVs and things like that that we saw during the 1990s. They were done with Haitian immigrants, but generally it was not placed at the same level of national security and public safety and things like that within the legal administrative apparatus. I think with the new orders, as military aircrafts are being used to deport thousands of people, maybe even tens of thousands of people, as far back as India. Um, um, the southern borders are now the status is that the current situation at the southern border qualifies an invasion. Guantanamo Bay has been ordered for a reconstruction for deportation, and we did a full show on that with Professor Naomi Paik. And even if you look at the federal funding freeze, there were three or four exceptions, and the exceptions were military, national security, public safety, and immigration enforcement. So now immigration is at par with kind of national security. That's sort of my reading. I am very, very curious about how you are reading all these different executives that are related to immigration.
So the the criminalizing of immigrants and the construction of immigrants as a threat to national security goes way, way back. Alien and sedition acts, we're talking about hundreds of years, over 100 years. Um, that idea about poisoning our blood, that there's this danger in immigrants, not, of course, in Northern European immigrants, because it's a very racialized understanding of what this danger of subversion is. Um, but Chinese exclusion and so exclusionary citizenship um, is deeply embedded in US history from the very start of US history, from the very first Naturalization Act of 1790. And racialized exclusionary citizenship has, and then, especially after citizenship by birth was created after the Civil War in 1868 with the 14th Amendment, racialized immigration exclusion. And the shift from racialized citizenship exclusion to racialized immigration exclusion came about because of citizenship by birth. That is, well, if we want to racially exclude the Chinese from citizenship, now we have to prevent them from immigrating, because if we allow them to immigrate, they might have babies, and that would be a contradiction to our racialized citizenship desires.
Also, the anxiety about marriage, right? Is it called miscegenation or something? There was a
Hmm.
lot, yeah, a lot of anxiety about Mexican
Anti-miscegenation.
women, yeah, Mexican women having sex or marrying white Americans.
Um, So, there were a couple, we could trace this very long history. We can also trace the more recent history, I think, back to the Clinton administration and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which went hand in hand with the welfare reform, um, which uh, layered new levels of criminalization upon immigrants. Um, we can look at the Obama administration and his constant reiteration that we're going to deport criminals. We're not going to, even with his sort of signature um, last minute creation of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Um, he did it, which granted temporary legal status to people who were brought here as children. The entire construction of DACA was these young people were brought here through no fault of their own. So they're not criminals like their parents are. Their parents are the criminals. So we don't want to deport them. We only want to deport their parents. So it was within a criminalization narrative that this particular group of immigrants is innocent, and therefore, by default, all other immigrants are criminal. Um, so I feel like the criminalization narrative has really deeply invaded so much popular thought about immigrants. And we have the association of immigrants with gangs and violence. And even though if you look at statistics, immigrants have lower crime rates than citizens do. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but it's been pretty constant. Um, and of course, the very concept of criminalization has been racialized throughout US history, because what is defined as a crime, who is criminalized, what neighborhoods are criminalized, um, how sentencing works, policing, all of these things have been deeply racialized. So, Uh, and with Trump's, uh, okay, so there's a lot we still don't know. Um, have more people been arrested, detained by ICE since Trump took office? It's really hard to tell because ICE is not releasing statistics. So, have ICE detentions been more highly publicized since Trump took office? Yes, clearly. That is, the Biden administration did not invite, ICE under the Biden administration did not invite Fox News and Dr. Phil to accompany their arrests and detentions. Um, but uh, immigration detention centers were pretty full during the Biden administration at about 30,000. That's pretty much capacity. So in order to incarcerate more people, other people have to be released. People have been deported under Trump. Obviously, people were deported under Biden as well. But almost everybody who has been deported since Trump took office was already in detention awaiting deportation, was detained under the Biden administration. So uh, there's been some pronouncements and some things at the border that have drastically changed. And the conditions of deportation, and as you mentioned, Guantanamo and also Panama, that is the extraterritoriality of immigration enforcement. That is, once people are removed from the United States, they have no US law does not apply. And that's exactly why the United States has used Guantanamo. In the 90s, Guantanamo was also used for immigrant detention. And then, of course, since 9/11, it's been used for, extraordinary detentions of people outside of the reach of the US Constitution. So you can have enhanced interrogation measures and all kinds of horrors going on in Guantanamo. And, people don't have to be charged. They don't have to have access to lawyers. Uh, people have been there for decades with no charges ever. It sounds kind of like Israel, but um, so the rehabilitation of Guantanamo as a migrant detention site, and the agreement with Panama to send people there has clearly removed immigrants, from any kind of uh, legal protections. They have no access to lawyers. They have no access to the press. They have no way to let anybody know what's happening to them. But we're talking about relatively small numbers of people still, and that's not to diminish the effect on a couple of hundred people who are suffering intensely. But it's not thousands of people or millions of people. And it really seems to be due more to President Trump's desire for spectacle, and maybe his 3-year-old, wanting to kill frogs or something, like just this innate sense of cruelty that he somehow enjoys. I've never known a 3-year-old who killed frogs, but I've read about this phenomenon, little kids who don't know what they're doing. So another thing to keep in mind, though, is that most of Trump's backers, like the real powers behind Trump, if you want to talk about the financial, the tech, the fossil fuel sectors, they don't really want lots of immigrants to be deported. Like, they may benefit from the heightened climate of fear, which makes immigrants more exploitable, but and the entire US economy relies on immigrant labor. So the overblown statements about how we're going to deport 11 million people would completely crush the US economy. Now, maybe Trump is willing to completely crush the US economy, and some of the firings and cutbacks at the federal level seem like are his backers are starting to get nervous. Like Republican senators are saying, wait a minute, we didn't really mean for you to do that in our state to that industry. Um, so where is this all going to go? I don't know. But um, but there are differing interests at play here, and exactly how they're going to work out, I can't tell you. But the other thing is that, and again, this is the optimistic way of looking at the publicity and the sort of horrific cruelty of, transporting people in shackles and not letting them use bathrooms or drink water or, on military flights. Um, is its potential for mobilization inside the United States. And I feel that, like, the grassroots left is scrambling a bit, and things are happening really fast, and everybody's trying to make sense of it. But I definitely, around the issue of immigration, feel like there is a huge rumbling going on that is going to be growing, and we're going to be seeing it more in many different spheres.
This was exactly what recently when Gonzalez of Democracy Now! Said that a lot of organizations that have been fighting for immigration rights have been scrambling to prepare for mobilization to protect immigrants' rights and so on. So exactly like echoing what you just said. Um, I have one last question on this segment, and it's a bit more general and a bit more theoretical. Is um, when we talk about, so the basic question is, how do you conceptualize or think about uh, immig immigration rights? What does it even mean? One thing is, of course, the very radical position that we start by saying that we don't recognize nation states. And then it's like everyone should get every right. And then it's a matter of more thinking about much deeper, substantial philosophical things about rights, maybe human rights, maybe other forms of rights, but it's much more deeper than immigration right becomes kind of meaningless. And then the other extreme is the complete self-interest of nation states, and then you reach the ridiculous extent to which we are United States has reached in a way. Um, as a scholar, where do you place yourself? How do you think about these things? Would there be, as long as there are nation states, there would be border protection force, there would be some laws. Okay, immigrants would not get citizenship rights, they would have all mobility rights, economic rights, or what are these layers? Are there any layers? So it's a very confusing thing for us, those of us who don't necessarily study the theme as experts. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
So, just to begin with, I would challenge something in your framing, which you said that, the one extreme is no borders, and the other extreme is that nation states only act in their own self-interest, with the implication that acting in the self-interest of the nation state means stopping immigration. So I just wanted to point out that really every single rich country has a declining population, is not replacing the population through natural birth rates. The populations are aging. So, to the extent that there is any kind of such thing as a national self-interest, which, I'm not sure that there is, but the economies and the services in these countries to even continue paying into Social Security, much less to provide elder care, relies on immigration. So right now, immigrant workers are being exploited, and that's wrong. They should not be exploited. But the idea that it's somehow in some kind of national self-interest to stop immigration, I don't buy that idea to begin with. So I also feel that there's a difference between what I would say, like, morally, I think is morally right, and what I think is politically feasible. So from a philosophical or moral position. I don't believe in nation states. Um, except, perhaps states from an administrative perspective, but without trying to connect the state to the nation. And, Jacqueline Stevens wrote a really interesting book about this called States Without Nations. That, if you look at Massachusetts, Massachusetts has borders, right? The state of Massachusetts, where I live, and it's bordered by Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont. No, not Maine, sorry. New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are the states that we border. So there is a border, like there's a sign that says exiting Massachusetts, entering Connecticut. And the laws are somewhat different in Massachusetts and Connecticut. The speed limit is different. If I were to move from Massachusetts, I pay taxes in Massachusetts. I don't pay Connecticut taxes. So I have certain rights in Massachusetts that I don't have in Connecticut to use public services in Massachusetts. Even to use the library, I need to have an address in Massachusetts to be able to use the library, to send my kids to local public schools. I have to have my car registered in Massachusetts, whatever, and, pay my vehicle taxes there. But the border does not prevent me from moving from Massachusetts to Connecticut and establishing my residence in Connecticut, getting a new driver's license, paying my taxes in Connecticut, and then using Connecticut's services. So you can have a very orderly administrative state that grants rights to people who establish a residence there without having restrictions on entry into that administrative state. Do you follow me? So, there's lots of different ways of conceiving a world without borders. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no administrative states. It means that there's no restrictions from moving from one administrative state to another. At the same time, I realize that in the current political climate, that's not going to happen for a very long time. So here, I think, is where we come back to that question of the lesser of two evils. That is, we're in a situation that's causing a lot of harm to a lot of people right now. What are some of the things that we can do that will make a more just world than the world we have now, that will alleviate some of the most egregious violations of human rights that are going on now, and that are politically possible in the foreseeable future? So I think that's where I would start. And a lot of the things that need to be done are simply rolling back bad policies that have been implemented very recently. So, like, we know that 10 years ago, we didn't have all of the bad policies we have now. So let's start undoing some of them and going back to where we were 10 years ago. I think the concept of labor rights, and, this was something where I feel like there was kind of an opening during COVID that has sort of dissipated, but we can go back to it. The concept of essential workers, and that essential workers should not have fewer rights than privileged workers. They should have more rights than privileged workers. Like, there should be extra compensation and extra guarantees for people who are risking their lives for the well-being of others. So, yeah, things like that.
Yeah, that was a really good answer from you. I really like that you reframed the idea, which is a dominant idea, but it's completely false, that national interest is necessarily at odds with the interest of immigrants. Given particularly in the United States, all the studies about its economic projection, they assume that if the United States has to even keep growing at 1.5, 1.75, even up to 2%, which is like fairly high, is predicated with the assumption that immigrants would would continue to keep flowing because that will lead to value addition through labor and also in keeping the interest rates down. And finally, also, if there has to be some check on the debt to GDP ratio, I mean, there are debates about that side, but if even going by the Trump administration logic, you want to reduce that, then it's a better idea to have more young people because a huge segment of state expenditure goes in Medicaid and things like healthcare. Which older your citizenship is, you need to pay more. Anyway, yeah.
Let me just say one more thing that I think is a really important part of the equation that we haven't mentioned yet, which is that a large portion of migrants are not exactly voluntary migrants. They're people who are forced out of their homelands, wherever those may be, whether it's Central America or India, um, because of conditions in the place where they live. And they would much rather have the right to stay home. And they only migrate because they don't have the right to stay home. So we also need to think about the global economic order and the fact that the United States has been the main enforcer of the global economic order. And let me just mention one really specific thing, which is investor state dispute settlement mechanisms, where so trade agreements are imposed on poor countries, which grant essentially extraterritorial rights to foreign corporations in those poor countries. Um, and so the ISDS mechanism uh, basically removes the sovereignty of the state to control the company. But if the state tries to do anything that the company claims is infringing on its profits, the company can sue the state before these business-friendly arbitration councils that basically take sovereignty away from governments. So to say nothing of the kinds of sanctions that the US imposes on, say, Venezuela, which are an enormous factor provoking the collapse of the Venezuelan economy and the exodus of Venezuelans. But that is, most people in the United States don't even know about these things. The trade policies, the foreign policies, the loans, the debt that that prevent the governments of poor countries from actually meeting the needs of their populations. So if we want to talk about immigration, yes, immigrants should have full rights, but people should not be forced out of their homelands by US policies either.
Yes, that is. We recently hosted Matt Kennard, whose book, The Silent Coup, I guess, if I'm not wrong. In the first chapter, he talks about these cases in countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and how even when they won the cases ultimately after rounds and rounds, they were like extremely expensive, sometimes running into hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars to even win those cases against these big multinational corporations whose only interests were profit interest. And it's a good book. I recommend that. This brings me to the final segment where I wanted to discuss energy policies of the new Trump administration. Looking at the executive orders, two things struck me. One is that it's the interest of the fossil fuel industry, and it's the private interest. So the things that are being talked about is cutting down red tapeism to bump up energy dominance. Councils that is formed is named as National Energy Dominance Council, and it is justified in the name of energy security, bumping up reserves and so on, while things like solar and wind are not mentioned in different forms of energy, while other forms are mentioned. Arctic National Wildlife Refugee drilling rights have been expanded. All the restrictions that were brought in during Biden and previous, I guess, some of them have been rolled down. And there are several jibes taken at energy efficiency standards on household appliances, and so on. What's your big take on what the new administration is trying to do in terms of climate change and energy policies, over and above dog whistling to its crowd that brought it in by voting with the idea that climate change is a hoax imposed on us merely by the elites?
So, um, the energy sector bought into Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. The energy sector, including the fossil fuel companies, got a lot from the Biden administration. Um, so again, I think we're seeing this as you suggested, this combination of like these three factors. One is just Trump being Trump, one is his base, and one is his backers. Oh, there, I made it so concise. Um, um, and a lot of the so-called alternative energy projects that he's cutting funding from, like these are big corporations, many of them fossil fuel companies, and many of them in red states that are developing these projects. So he's taking money away from his backers by doing this. And again, you see some of the Republican governors and senators saying, well, wait a minute, we didn't mean for you to do that in our states. We wanted you to impose that, on the blue states. So, uh, the Biden administration's restrictions on fossil fuel, and you mentioned this issue of security, energy security, and we also have to keep in mind the amount of uh, fossil fuel production that goes to export that's not even used domestically, because the United States is one of the biggest exporters, also, or the biggest, I believe, exporter. Don't quote me on that. I have to look at the figures
Yeah,
to be sure.
I guess you
Way up.
mean energy export, right?
Yes, energy
Yes,
export.
yes, yes, yes. I think it's the biggest or somewhere around that. Yeah.
And here we're talking about oil and natural gas and liquid natural gas. And so, uh, but I mean, I really think for the backers, it's all about profit. Like they don't really care if it's oil or gas or wind or solar. It's about money. Um, but clearly, there's a lot of money still to be made in fossil fuels, and there's a lot of infrastructure that's already there. Um, so like the planet has been going in the wrong direction. Like last year's emissions were the highest ever. Like despite all these agreements, despite all these national targets, despite all of the money that's been pouring into alternative energy, global emissions went up last year, and they also went up in the United States. So, it's kind of like talking about immigration. Like, I don't want to let the Biden administration off the hook and give the impression that, oh, they were really doing something and now it's all reversed. But I also don't want to let the Trump administration off the hook. And like, this is insane. The idea that governments should be actively promoting fossil fuel development. But of course, the United States government isn't the only government doing it. And it's not only those countries that we think of as like the bad guys, oil producers, it's countries like Norway, the great environmental paragons that social democracies. So, we're in deep trouble, and Trump certainly isn't doing anything to help gut us out of it. But what Biden was doing was so pathetic that it's hard to be very excited about it. And, it's the Inflation Reduction Act is always touted as the largest investment, the biggest climate policy. If that's the best we can do, we are in deep trouble. I mean, we are in deep trouble.
Well, Professor Chomsky, that was a wonderful conversation, and thank you very much for your time.
You're so welcome. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.